Hi, I'm Ruiz, and this is Bowie. Welcome to our classroom. In this video, we will be discussing the method of deontology, which is an ethical methodology that emphasizes the action as the focus of the moral decision. Let's dive in. It's ethics, brah. In my past video, I discussed several ethical methodologies. Contrary to consequentialism, which emphasizes the consequence of a moral decision, deontology is interested in the very act itself. Deontologists place greater emphasis on a person's will and on a person's agency. In other words, the things we intend and the things we have the power to do. And deontologists often believe that we don't have agency or power over the consequences of our actions. Here are my friends Bowie and Goliath. Now let's suppose I give Bowie a treat. Why did I do that? Let's suppose I was intending to make Bowie feel good and like me more. But there's an unintended consequence. He's jealous. And that demonstrates that while I might sometimes do good actions intending this good consequence, we don't always have 100% control over the outcome of our decisions. Because we can't control the future or control how other people will react. So for a deontologist, since we don't have agency over the consequence of our decision, but we do have agency over our will and our actions, that's where we should focus. Deontologists would say that our actions must always reflect our moral duty. The big question is, how do we determine our moral duty? How do we arrive at these principles that should guide our actions? I will discuss two approaches, a secular response and a religious response. The secular deontological theory I will discuss is that brought forth by Immanuel Kant. But first, let's start with his anthropology, his conception of human nature. There are two important principles in Kantian anthropology that we should consider. First, he distinguishes between a person's inclinations and rationality. Inclinations mainly refer to our desires, which are caused by biology, emotions, or triggered by our social context. Rationality refers to our capacity to think abstractly, to think about ideas that are separate from our concrete context. The second anthropological principle is autonomy. For Kant, this means freedom. However, this doesn't just mean do whatever you want. No. For Kant, truly autonomous people are those who are able to base their moral decisions on pure rationality and are not slaves to their inclinations. For example, some people might say that a person who cheated on their spouse is free because they chose to do what they did. But Kant would say, hold on, that person has given in to their inclinations, therefore that person is not free. True freedom is our rational capacity to decide and recognize what our guiding moral principles will be. With that in mind, Kant proposes that the moral person is one who rationally and willingly commits to acting in accordance with a priori moral principles. What the heck does a priori mean? Sounds like a Harry Potter spell. A priori! It's priori, not priori. When we say something is a priori, we're basically saying that that something existed by itself before it was conceived by something else and before it was recognized. A priori means existing before. A priori moral principles are principles that exist by themselves as objects, regardless of whether we recognize them or not. They don't need us to conceive them or generate them into existence. They simply exist a priori, before we conceive of them. The opposite of an a priori principle would be an a posteriori principle. A posteriori, existing after. People who believe that moral principles are a posteriori simply believe that human beings create the principles. They will them into existence. And they are a posteriori because they exist after human beings conceive of them. They do not exist before humans create them. Kant argues that a priori principles do exist and that there's a way to recognize them. For that you need a categorical imperative. That does not sound like a Harry Potter spell. Kant's deontology seeks to recognize a priori moral principles. And Kant says that it is our duty to willingly align our actions to those moral principles. Yeah, but what principles? Kant proposes two categorical imperatives. What's a categorical imperative? A categorical imperative is a mandate we all have to follow at all times, regardless of the context, the consequence, or the circumstance. And Kant proposes two categorical imperatives. There's a lot of twos in this section. First is the categorical imperative of the universal law. This categorical imperative states, act as if you can rationally will for your actions to become universalized. What does that mean? It means asking, does it make sense for me to want everyone to act in the way I'm acting now? Time out! That sounds like a consequentialist. What would happen if everyone acted this way? Isn't that asking about the outcome? Not quite. Some people just can't understand Kant. For Kant, the universal law, categorical imperative, does not ask a consequentialist question. Kant does not care about the outcome of universalizing an action, but rather asks, what happens to the very nature of the action if it became universalized? Let's look at an example. Should people tell the truth? Kant would try to reason. What does it mean to universalize truth-telling? What would happen to truthness, to the nature of truth? If everyone were to say the truth would still exist as true. However, the same is not true if people lie. Lying presupposes that I know what is true and I'm telling you something other than the truth. If everyone were lying, then no one would know what the truth is. Therefore, no one would be able to lie, because lying presupposes that you know what is true and saying something else. Therefore, the universalization of lying destroys lying. It destroys lyingness. So Kant reasons that that is not an a priori moral principle. It does not stand by itself. If it can't be universalized, it does not contain the substance of a moral principle. Second, Kant establishes that every human being is an end in and of themselves. No human should ever be treated as a means towards some other end. You can't use human beings as a tool or an object for something else, because each person has intrinsic value as a rational being. Think about it. If we all treated humans as means and not as ends, then we would be destroying humanness. An example is slavery, which we call dehumanizing. Kant would derive moral principles from the two categorical imperatives, which are act as if you can will your action to become universal and treat every human being as an end. Alright, let's summarize. Kant thinks true autonomy comes from acting rationally and not from giving in to inclinations. The moral person is the one that rationally and willingly chooses to align their actions with moral principles. And these moral principles exist a priori, before they're even recognized. To recognize the moral principles, we must abide by two categorical imperatives. These are two things we must always do. First, we should act as if we willed for our actions to be universal. If everyone acted in the same way, would the nature of the action be preserved? Second, all human beings should be treated as ends and not as means. Now, Kant's theory has several critiques. First, are humans really able to exercise pure rationality? Can we separate ourselves from our feelings, emotions, and experiences? That seems like a difficult task. As a result, human society has not arrived at a collective set of categorical imperatives. We haven't agreed about what universal principles we should follow. Second, Kantian deontology seems a bit rigid. Being so rigid about morality prevents us from recognizing some of the grayness in some of the moral choices we have to make. I recall the character of Javert from Les Miserables. He was a dutiful cop unable to recognize principles beyond his duty. Third, this rational duty following ignores other parts of human nature, such as emotions or relationships. Deontology sometimes fails to recognize that some things make some people happy, like eating a slice of pizza every once in a while, which goes against moral duties of health and wellness. Furthermore, if I went to visit a friend who's in the hospital, am I doing it out of duty or out of the relationship I have with that person? How would my friend feel if I expressed, I am here to do my duty as a friend? It doesn't make it personal between my friend and I. Now let's discuss a religious response. Now, religions believe that our moral principles and our moral duties have been revealed to us by a higher power, and that revelation takes many forms. Jews believe that God spoke to the ancient Hebrews through the Torah and through the prophets. Their sacred texts capture many moral principles, such as the Decalogue, also known as the Ten Commandments, and other norms about how we should treat God, treat each other, and operate a just society. The Catholic tradition adopts the Jewish text and develops a new set of documents that also contain moral principles. The Gospels, which contain Jesus' life story, contain several other moral principles, such as the Beatitudes, the principle of charity, and the Golden Rule. Now, the Catholic tradition believes that, in addition to Scripture, God continues to reveal God's moral plan to us through the institutional church and through our lives. And they often call that revelation that takes place outside of Scripture natural law. However, Scripture and natural law do not contradict each other, they complement each other. I will discuss natural law in another video. Thus, the Judeo-Christian tradition derives moral principles from God's revelation. Of course, the critique of a religious response is that it depends on people believing in that faith for the principles to take hold in their lives and decisions. Now, like every ethical methodology, deontology can be applied at two different levels. principles. First is personal morals. Here people make sure that their individual decisions on a day-to-day basis line up with their moral duty. Spouses tell the truth to their significant other. Students don't cheat on tests. Parents provide food for their children. Young people help elderly people with daily tasks. Second is the social justice level. Deontology has greatly contributed to social justice because it provides a foundation for human rights. Modern conceptions of human rights are primarily deontological. Human rights outline a set of claims that all human beings are entitled to, and they are deontological in two primary ways. First, they treat every human being as an end. Kant! And second, they ensure that individual actions and institutional policies never violate those rights. And that's deontological because the actions of people and institutions should never violate the moral principles of human rights. To revisit the example of torture from a previous video, a deontologist would recognize that every human being has a right to not be tortured. Therefore, they would never act in a way that would violate that right. They would never torture, no matter the consequence or circumstance. They have a moral duty to the principles outlined by human rights. I'll discuss human rights more in depth in a later video. Overall, deontology offers important contributions to the field of ethics. While many may think this method is too rigid or impersonal, it is undeniable that human rights theory has significantly helped advance a global conversation on social justice. So the deontological question of moral duty and a priori moral principles is central to the field of ethics. Thanks for watching my video. What do you think of deontology? Leave your comments below. My next video will explore consequentialism. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you soon.